I could only speak English when I was 21 years old, and I went on to start traveling. My background's actually in electronic engineering, and oh, good, glad it looks good. I got into languages for several years. It was a very slow process, but I, over the course of 14 years, developed a language learning strategy, and that's what my books are about. So my books are actually specifically for people who do not have natural talents in languages. And now swinging that back to this question, Miss Berkey says, I have a really bad memory. So I can actually totally relate to that. So I'm always misplacing my keys. I actually literally this morning lost my keys again, and I wasted a half an hour trying to find them. So that kind of shows you just as a basic example. But other than that, I am not the kind of person you would describe as a memory sponge. Like you could tell me your name or you could tell me the translation of a word, and unfortunately, I'm likely to forget it quite quickly after that. So one way I compensated for that was actually by learning mnemonic techniques. So these are techniques other people have developed, and I mentioned them in all of the language hacking courses. And these are techniques that help me to remember words. So you do not have to have a good memory. This is something you can learn. So for instance, when I was learning French, I needed to remember that the word for train station was gare, G-A-R-E. And this was hard because you can, in school, they never really taught me how, I took German in school, I did very poorly with it, but they never really taught me how to learn vocabulary. So I just presumed rote memorization was the only way to do it. So I would just say in my head, gare, train station, gare, train station, gare, train station, and just like repeat it over and over again. And maybe it would sink in, and it didn't really work that well for me. So I would just forget it like the next day. So instead, with using this word as the example, I came up with a mnemonic. So I imagined, the first thing that came to my mind when I thought of gare was, or gar, using the English version of the pronunciation, was Garfield. Just kind of came into my brain. So I pictured Garfield, the famous orange overweight cat, in a train station. And I imagined I gave him a whole backstory. He was trying to get a train to the world's lasagna eating competition. And he just barely made it to the train station in time. And he was running, trying to catch his train. And since he's not in great shape, he was like puffing and saw his train already pulling off. And he ran and he caught it just in time. And it's a ridiculous story, but I have like this very visual representation of it in my head. And the great thing is, because it's so silly, it really burned that image into my mind for me. So I really, and it's symmetrical, which is very important with mnemonics. So what this means is, not only when I saw the French word or heard the French word gare, I would think, okay, it sounds like Garfield, he was in the train station, so that means train station. It would also work the other way. So when I would be speaking French, and I would need to say train station, then I would think, okay, train station. What was happening in a train station? Garfield was running through it. Gare. And that is kind of how I fixed my memory issue. Now, it may sound like a lot of work to do this for all of the vocabulary terms. But the thing is, when I began learning languages in my 20s, it was initially a little slow, but very quickly I started to develop a kind of a knack for very quickly seeing a mnemonic and just making it within 2 seconds. And that meant I could grow my vocabulary quicker. Maybe for the first couple of weeks, you'll have to like rack your brains for like 2 or 3 minutes coming up with like something like that example I just gave. But very quickly, you can get to the stage where you're able to process them a lot faster. So this has helped me a ton with my memory. Another thing that's helped is using flashcards. And flashcards use, especially the ones that use some form of spaced repetition. So I can get into that if it comes up in another question. How do you practice each language? This is another very important thing that I learned in my process. So I graduated with my degree in engineering and I moved to Spain. And in my mind, I imagined that would be it. That's all I needed to do was just move to the country. And I know a lot of people in this year are thinking to themselves, this is the year maybe that they won't learn a language, or that they know they won't learn a language because they can't travel to the country because of global lockdowns. But actually, being in the country does not solve your language learning problem. And for 6 months that I lived in Spain, those first 6 months, I did not learn any Spanish because I got lazy and I saw Spaniards who could speak English. I found other English speakers. And even though I was physically in Spain, I kind of created this English immersion environment. So it wasn't very useful. So I tried a lot of other things. I tried taking group classes, traditional learning methods that way, and it just didn't cut it. So what I found eventually was that actually, after multiple experiments, that speaking the language, regardless of how terribly I was speaking it, was the solution. And in a nutshell, I kind of condensed that to speak from day one. So if you speak from day one, I know you're going to sound like Tarzan, and this is how I sounded with my Spanish. I would just piece together grammatically, like completely non-functional sentences, but they would understand me. And then bit by bit, I got better. This is something in the language hacking courses I talk about quite a lot, and it's why I wanted to make a book around this method that embraced a spoken first process that you are okay with making mistakes for. So this is kind of where the whole language hacking philosophy comes from. But hopefully that more or less addresses that question from Miss Berkeley. So or Miss Berkey. So feel free to add any questions in the chat, but I'll just kind of scroll a little bit here to. Sorry about that. I have my phone make barking sounds if there's somebody coming up to the door, but yeah, it's all good. Okay, so what language have you found? Probably showing you that. Okay, sorry, scroll to the right place here. Do you have any tips for remembering verb or adjective endings? I find it so difficult. All right, so here, this is an interesting one because the verb or adjective endings is not something I generally would recommend people worry too much about as a beginner. Since I alluded to previously, you have to really embrace making mistakes as part of your learning process. And this is something I fully recommend people not worry too much about. Like if you're putting an O instead of an A, or in the likes of French, you're not adding that E to the end of some adjectives. It's really not the end of the world. This is not one of the biggest things you need to be worried about as a beginner. So let me just get that out there immediately, that you don't want to be worrying too much about remembering the correct endings. Like if you, to use English as an example, if you say, I is Irish, that's obviously grammatically incorrect, but you would understand somebody saying that. And that is what you want to be prioritizing at the absolute start. Okay, hold on. There's somebody at my door, and I'm actually expecting a passport replacement. I'll be right back. If there's any questions, put them in. Just give me 2 seconds. Okay, sorry about that. So just continuing from where I was, if you want to remember verb endings, though, one thing that I've done with that is firstly to find the patterns that you might want to see that have like the most regular verbs tend to have patterns with like if I take Spanish as an example, if a verb ends in AR, you know how it has specific endings with that. You want to see these patterns where if it ends with ONTAR, you change that to UENTAR. It's a weird example, and I'm hoping if there are specific issues people have, you're welcome to add them to the comments above. But yeah, that's it's not necessarily something you have to memorize. It's more something you get through lots of practice. All right. So let's see. I go to the next question here. I want to change the order from going from bottom to. Okay, so any tips on tenses? This is a question from Anna. I'm trying to learn German and finding it so hard to get my head around it. Okay, so for German tenses, it's really not as bad as you think, but the problem I find mostly when I'm starting off and I'm having issues remembering verb tenses and such is, firstly, you do need a lot more practice and practice getting it incorrect to get used to the sound of the language. But specifically when it comes to so I guess I alluded to this previously when I was mentioning for Spanish, that you want to see what the specific patterns are for when verbs end a particular way. So it's not that you have to learn each individual verb's sentence structure, each individual verb's conjugation. It's more a case that you want to see which verb endings have a particular conjugation and learn one really well. And for that, I do recommend flashcards. So I might use an app like Anki and have the ending of a word repeated to me, like for the whatever it is, the third person plural, for instance. And as I repeat that over and over again through the flashcard app, that's where I know I make some progress and I'm able to process what this word is in active and live situations. Okay. But then in terms of tenses, the getting your head around it, it's sometimes it's easier to make the quickest parallel to English tenses first. And again, I find the issues people have with the more advanced parts of learning a language tend to not be as important in these beginner stages. So I'm hoping that that makes sense. Okay, so next, how long will it take me to learn a new language? Okay, I know there are different factors that affect this, but on average, how long does it take? This is such an interesting question, and it's one I've kind of had the center of my career go around quite a lot. But effectively, it's like the question, how long is a piece of string? It kind of really depends on a lot of things. So how long does it take to learn a new language? It implies there's some kind of an ending point, that you reach a certain level and you have finished learning a language. And I wouldn't agree with that. I would go as far as to say native speakers technically haven't finished learning their language. There are still new vocabulary terms that come up and the like. So you're never actually finished learning a language. But what's more useful is to ask when you reach certain levels. So if you have the chance to look into the European Common Framework, you'll actually see there are typically 6 different levels in language that you can potentially reach. That's A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. And these A is beginner, B is intermediate, C is advanced, and the 1 and 2 represent lower and upper. So I would actually be aiming for particular points on that scale. So I would aim for instance, B1, lower intermediate. And that's something you can do in the span of a few intensive months. But if you're aiming, you might think, well, no, I want to learn it perfectly, the C2. It's not as simple as that, because I've reached C2 in a couple of my languages. And to be honest, it wasn't necessarily that worth having prioritized it in the case of some languages that I'm only going to be using in a mostly social environment. I've put that extra work to reach the C levels when I have had to work professionally as a translator or as an engineer in the language. But actually, for the most part, it's been a very straightforward process of deciding I want to get fluent in the language. And fluency is something you can reach in a reasonable time if fluency for you means the B2 or upper intermediate stage. So this is something that I recommend people aim for if you can do it intensively, like if the current situation gives you a lot of free time. You could theoretically reach this in the span of 6 or so months. I've given myself 3 months, and people would know my blog is fluent in 3 months. My first book is fluent in 3 months. This is actually something I've only been able to aim for with a good 10 years of experience initially under my belt in languages. It's not something I think someone just kicking off would reach this kind of level, a high level in a language in just 3 months. But you could realistically, if you were truly fully dedicated to it, you could reach that in a good 6 months in many European languages. And it would have to be a major priority for you. So like with that in mind, you could reach fluency within a short span of a certain number of months, which obviously depend, because ultimately, like a lot of us would say, well, I've spent, like in my case, I spent 5 years learning German in school. So 5 years is obviously more than 3 months. So this begs the question, well, you know, it doesn't, what's actually happening here? So what's happening is in those 5 years, I was only actually spending an hour or two in a class with 30 other people who were not as interested or not very interested in learning the language. I didn't find it interesting in that particular environment, and I wasn't really doing any work in between. So it was maybe a total of 2 hours a week, but it was 2 hours uninterested, very non-dedicated. Like I really didn't care. It was 2 empty hours a week spread over 5 years, gave me nothing particularly useful. So that's the thing that people miss when they think, oh, I've learned a language for years. Have you really learned a language for years? Or have you for years had an hour or two a week? And that's like in less than ideal situations. So you can do it in a few months if you turn it around and make it more about the process being speaking that language consistently. And generally when someone's learning intensively, I recommend they do it 3 or 4 hours a day. So how long it takes doesn't actually matter about the number of months or years. It's about the number of hours, because the number of hours, if you spend 5 years learning a language, but it's only an hour a week and not even a good hour at that, have you really spent 5 years? I wouldn't say so. So it's kind of my retort to, but I spent X years learning a language. And I'm like, I don't know about that. Whereas like those 5 years I spent learning German were nothing compared to the 3 months that I spent learning German, like into my mid-20s, I think it was. It was a very different experience because I was truly dedicated to it. It was my most important project all day. I wasn't watching English TV, and I wasn't speaking English unless I absolutely had to for work. That's kind of the level of dedication that changed it to be the month's time span. But it really depends on how the quality of those hours and what you're putting into them. Okay, so do a couple more questions on Instagram, and then I see Ryan has added some questions over to the chat. So just be online for another 5 or 10 minutes. Make sure to push your questions in while you can. All right. So next we have, what language have you found the hardest to learn and why? This is another interesting question from Charlotte. So effectively, I have dabbled in like the main European languages. I've done some Hungarian. I've done some Mandarin Chinese. To like, these would be languages I got to some form of conversational level. I've also done basics in like Quechua, the Inca language, and some Arabic and American Sign Language. So I have a wide range of languages that I've covered. And ultimately, the most difficult experience in all of these was Spanish, to be totally honest. Because Spanish was the first one, and it took me a whole year. And like, contrary to what I just said, this was actually a year of lots of work. So I was truly giving the time to the language, but it was a year where I put the time in and I did not have very good methods. This is my first attempt as an adult to learn a language. So it was a year to get to basic conversational level. Whereas to contrast to that, I got to that the same basic conversational level in 3 months in Mandarin. And there's a video of me on YouTube. I wasn't fluent, but I was definitely at a decently basic conversational level where I could function as long as the other person spoke slowly and clearly. I could have a lot of conversations after 3 months, compared to it taking me a year in Spanish, where I was giving it a lot of time. And it's because I didn't apply the right techniques. I wasn't truly embracing a speak from day one approach at the time with Spanish. And I was still relying, getting too intimidated by grammar. So I wasn't practicing it because I thought I needed to learn more grammar. So ironically, Spanish was my most difficult language experience. And having seen and made those mistakes, I was able to make each language from there go a little bit faster. Okay. And let's see what else we got here. Yeah, I can't hide this one. So there's a question I can't show you here from Den Stars. What should I do if I want to learn 2 languages at once? Okay, so an interesting question that personally, I know other people do this, but personally, I highly recommend you don't do this. I highly recommend you focus on just one language and then get that to at least a high conversational, if not genuine fluent stage, and then move on to your other language. And the way I've become a polyglot to be able to say I speak multiple languages is by never learning 2 languages at the same time. I focus on just one language, and then when I feel it's at a stage that I can genuinely say I can have true fluent conversations in it, then I move on to another language, and it means I don't lose that first language. There are other polyglots who learn multiple languages, and I think they are more talented than I am for sure. But I generally recommend if you're super clever, go for it. But if you're a regular person, you may be better off just focusing on the one and then the other. Okay. All right, and then so I'll wrap it up by answering questions from Ryan over on YouTube. Any tips with confidence when speaking? I fear making mistakes. Okay, this is an interesting one, and I think the one tip I would give is to maybe, before getting into the speaking part, get used to the output part where you're producing in the language, so you can kind of adjust to this by typing in the language. So you might want to join chat rooms, or there's loads of like Discord servers online in multiple languages, depending on the language that you're learning. And you can just learn how to like actually produce something in that language. That's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do that helped me a ton in multiple language projects that I've shared on my blog. The first month, I wasn't getting out and about and practicing the language so much, but my main target was to make videos in the language. So this is speaking the language, but it's speaking which also removes the interaction part of having to understand somebody in that moment. That came very shortly after for me to kind of gain that experience. But the speaking at the beginning part was mostly you're lacking that confidence for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it's intimidating to speak to a person and worry about them correcting you or judging you. They pretty much never do. But I understand that those doubts are going to be there. That's one problem. But the other problem is just you're not used to speaking. So you can solve this by just practicing speaking by yourself, speaking out loud to yourself all day, and then working up towards maybe you want to put a video online, like upload a YouTube video, but decide I'm going to do this within 2 weeks. So you have that like end goal, and you're spending the 2 weeks working up to focusing on it and reaching that particular stage. So that's kind of what I would recommend for that, is to ease yourself in, and then finally, like, the next step isn't to walk up to a bunch of strangers and start talking to them. It's to maybe hire a teacher. You can get them pretty affordably on a site like italki, and we partner with italki for the language hacking courses. And you make sure that you find a teacher that seems patient and such, and they will adjust, and they're not going to judge you. They're used to helping learners. So this is a big thing that's helped me immensely in the beginning stages, is having somebody who's used to teaching a learner rather than just going to random native speakers. That's the first thing. And then the last question I'll answer before I mention some deals that Teach Yourself are doing is, should I have a daily structure in place when learning a new language? Yes, I mean, obviously structure makes a big difference in a lot of ways, but I think most important, it's not like when I think of my language learning schedule, I don't have every single minute of it planned out completely. I'm not that organized. What I do have structure for are language lessons, because speaking is so important to me for the reason I just mentioned, that like that practice is so crucial. I would book sessions with teachers and have that in my calendar. And then my language structure of my day is kind of revolving around that. And I'm leading up to that particular lesson by studying something that I know I have to have ready for that lesson ahead of time. So that's an example of like the structure naturally comes in when speaking the language is your focus. That means that you're going to create a structure around those spoken lessons. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, Ryan. So I guess the last thing I do want to make sure that I mention is that Teach Yourself until the 30th of September, so just for the next 6 days, are doing all of the language hacking books that I've written with them. The ebook versions are half the price for anyone who gets them, and that's using this code here, EDL2020. If you're in the UK, you can actually get 3 of the language hacking books. That's Spanish, Italian, and French. You can get them on the Kindle, and they are vastly reduced. I think they're only 99p, and that is going to end very shortly. But if you're anywhere outside of the UK, you can just search for the Teach Yourself store, and you'll see the ability to buy the ebooks, and then you use this code here. Otherwise, look for Teach Yourself on Instagram, and I'll share what they look like here. You scroll down, yeah. Move this code up. So TY Open Road. This is their Instagram account. If you go there, they'll be sharing all the language deals that they're currently running. So check that out. And otherwise, on Saturday, I hope you guys have a wonderful European Day of Languages. I hope you found some of these questions useful. I hope I addressed a couple of the issues you guys were having. And otherwise, take it very easy. And until next time, happy language learning.